You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. I have Jim Kanaris. He's an associate professor at McGill University, part of the philosophy of religion area. So we're going to talk today about his work. Jim, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
So with the philosophy of religion, the area that you study, what are some of the projects that you worked on and how did you get into the field?
So philosophy of religion is a rather complex field because it's one of the oldest ways of examining the religious phenomenon. So in the European tradition or in the Western tradition, more generally, it has morphed into many different ways of raising deeply philosophical, metaphysical types questions about the universe. And philosophy of religion has always been pegged as that kind of area which looks at this area, this speculative area, as some people call it. And so it became something different in the 19th century. I don't want to bore you with details here about that history, but when the field of religious studies started to emerge, philosophy of religion also changed into various ways of examining the religious phenomenon. But philosophy had always been that kind of way that individual thinkers would manage religion. And it has many different ways of, I guess you would say, configure the religious phenomenon. I got involved in philosophy of religion in that kind of general way of just raising and asking the big questions in life, because I was always interested in that. But when I entered into a more formalized way of raising those kinds of questions in the university, it took on a very different face. And so in religious studies in particular, which is a huge field covering many different disciplines, philosophy of religion can be treated either as a kind of normative discourse of a kind of theological orientation or a strictly philosophical one. And in religious studies, it kind of broadened. Yeah.
Quick diversion here. What's one of the most common questions that you have to wrestle with in terms of philosophy of religion? Just to give listeners a context.
Sure. I mean, traditionally, it's the big question about can the existence of God be proven, or why does evil exist if we have to entertain the notion of an all-loving God and an all-powerful God? And so this kind of involves you in various philosophical conundrums, which people in the philosophical tradition in the West have tried to alleviate. But that became part of a kind of traditional way of asking those questions. But of course, if you enter into the field of religious studies, it becomes something grander, right? Because you're not just dealing with the notion of a deity, you're also dealing with other kinds of religious phenomena, other kinds of religious concerns, where, for example, a deity isn't at the forefront of that experience. So obviously, in that kind of a case, raising philosophical questions is going to have a different face. It's going to have a different orientation.
What's one of these really tough, long-lasting questions that you feel like you've made some headway in answering, either personally or professionally?
Well, I mean, that's a really great question. When it comes to issues of a personal nature, I mean, people can only resolve those questions as best as they can relative to their own field of study. I haven't made much headway in terms of answering those questions because I never entered it blindly, right? I mean, I was a person of faith. I entered into the kind of intellectual quest to understand that faith, which is basically the definition of theology, which is faith-seeking understanding. But in my professional context, in the context of doing philosophy of religion in a religious studies environment, it involved addressing or at least helping individuals who have those questions alleviate some of the problems of a methodological and theoretical nature. And so that's one of the reasons why it's such a complex issue. I don't do, for example, religious epistemology. It kind of suggests the idea that epistemology, that quest for trying to understand what knowledge is or what qualifies as knowledge, has a specifically religious a religious comportment to it. And what I do more or less is a philosophy of religious studies, which means that I help individuals ask questions of a kind of subjective nature, namely where they are in their quest for understanding or managing the religious phenomenon. For example, how might a sociologist who is interested in the study of religion broach their own personal interests in connection with their professional concerns? So not just study an object that can be sociologically managed, but also bring their own personality and own personal questions to that kind of quest. It kind of provides a clearing for a level of self-awareness on the part of the academics. So my type of philosophizing in a religious studies environment involves that greater issue about how do individuals of a specialized class of interest broach these very personal questions in an objectively responsible way.
Examples are always good because it seems a little bit nebulous. So what's an example of, again, a question that you've modified the approach on that maybe got you further, a better understanding, or you were able to get better responses from talking to other people about their answers to the question?
Yeah, I guess the only way I can provide a concrete example of that is when I, for example, teach my students, the history of studying religion or the history of the field of religion. I allow them an opportunity, or at least I provide an opportunity for them to consider the ways in which they're implicated in their own research interests. So, for example, if you're interested in the history of religion or an aspect of religion in its historical context, what does it mean for you as a questioner who is raising this question? How does answering, for example, what form religion took in the 16th century help you to mediate, your own concerns in the 21st century? So it becomes an explicit preoccupation with understanding that when we deal with religion, we're not just dealing with a ready-made object out there in the world, but we're actually constructing it in some way due to our framework of analysis. A sociological treatment of religion is going to feed into an orientation on the part of the questioner about what religion or what aspect of religion is considered to be important for the individual. If one is thinking about it in terms of psychology, how does answering the questions that, a psychological orientation, what does that do for the individual inquirer, him or herself? And so it's what I've done. When you asked me before, like, what have I achieved in terms of my own professional objectives? It's to have provided a way for individuals who come to the study of religion from a wide variety of backgrounds to raise those kinds of basic normative questions surrounding their own selves as human beings in a world who embody a certain value system, who embody an orientation in the world, so that they can both bridge their academic interests with their own personal concerns. So I have been involved for many years now in the construction of a method of religious studies so that we're learning more about religion scholars or religion inquirers than we are about actual religious traditions and their teachings. I mean, there is, of course, room for that in religious studies because that's what religious studies is predominantly interested in. But as a philosopher of religion, I'm interested in providing a kind of generalized way of approaching, these ancient type questions with a contemporary sensibility, like how do we understand our world today? What is the going way of understanding religion? Do I agree with that, predominant approach? What are my problems with it? How does it stifle interest in religion? So we're talking about this very generalized type of philosophizing in a religious studies environment. And that has been my predominant objective, yeah.
Well, I'd just like to know, I would think that by studying the philosophy and history of religious inquiry, that you would have gotten some additional insights in your journey. So, can you, at least you have a different perspective. What's your perspective, let's say, on some of these old, tough questions? Like, if it's okay just to ask you a couple. I don't know, what's your answer?
Yeah, well, I guess in terms of what my orientation has been, it's mostly providing a clearing for answering those questions. That is, when we raise or ask questions about the existence of God in our contemporary situation, which is very much invested, methodologically speaking, in a mechanistic scientific worldview, how does addressing the question of God's existence take on a new life when we, in fact, question such an orientation? That is, so if the going framework for understanding God's existence happens to be materialistic or mechanistic science, when we contextualize that framework of looking at questions of God's existence, how has it provided an opportunity for people to rethink that age-old question in a way that doesn't give the upper hand to, say, a materialistic view of reality?
I can give you probably an example here, maybe from my own experience.
Sure.
I've done 3,000 plus interviews on, with scientists, researchers, et cetera. So I have a street MBA, I guess, in biology, biological issues.
Sure.
So as I've gone, it's gotten more and more and more complicated, the picture of biology. And therefore, to me, it's gotten to the point where, and this is just my personal opinion, but biology is so unbelievably complex. There's no way in my mind that it arose just randomly. So that brings me back to, there must have been a designer and a creator. Right. So in that way, it's funny. The overabundance of technology and knowledge has brought me to this direction, not the lack of it.
Right. Well, that's an excellent example. And that feeds into, let's say, contemporary philosophies of religion, which manage the God question in that way. However, if you approach, I don't know, somebody who may have a more sociological or psychological or anthropological interest in religion, their frame of reference with regard to those questions are typically understood to be, if I answer this question, it's going to be interesting information for, as a kind of objective piece of information about reality for a certain class of individuals. However, as an anthropologist or as a sociologist, I don't really see this as having a bearing on my own understanding of that question. That is, that may not be the pressing question for me as an anthropologist. It might be, for example, for a theologian. It might be for a certain class of philosopher of religion, say somebody in the Christian religious tradition. I recognize that you had John Lennox on a while back. I don't know how long ago, but it's fairly recent.
Recently. Yeah, he was a really nice guy.
Yeah, he's a great guy. But you see, if I can take a step back and just contextualize that conversation, that is an individual who is doing Christian apologetics, which would be a kind of species of philosophy of religion that would interest students of religion, but not all students of religion, right? So they would see that as perhaps facilitating an understanding of the deity if one entertains a certain worldview, like an Abrahamic religious worldview. But it might not address the needs and concerns of, say, a scholar of Buddhism who is interested in that part of the tradition, which doesn't entertain a notion of the deity. And so it doesn't become a pressing issue for them. However, the issue about the relationship of a material universe to, say, a Buddhist idea of consciousness does become something of interest for that person who has a certain philosophical inclination about such issues. So you see, it kind of has to be differentiated in the wider gambit of religious studies, where one type of an approach, a Christian apologetical one, which is, it has its own agenda, it has its own desire to alleviate certain doubts about the deity in the context of Western European traditions. But in the broader context, it really can't inform the types of orientation that religion students have. So it's a very broad field, and that's why it's so difficult to do philosophy of religion in that environment, say, focusing on a specific issue as what does the question of God mean for me? Or, what does the question of enlightenment mean for me? And so on. And so it's a very rich and complex field that is really hard to reduce to one type of orientation with regard to, questions of ultimate concern.
I have a a thought process, which I don't think I'm certainly the first one to think it, but I just wonder what you would call this. So, have you run into anyone that believes perhaps that God has come to many different cultures and many different people in many guises? And let's say, Muslims see God as Allah and they see him as maybe distant and, like a very stern father figure, etc.
Yes.
Could they be right at the same time that Christians are right and see something different? At the same time that Buddhists are right, at the same time that Hindus are right. And that thought process of saying maybe not all, but a lot of the major religions are correct. We're just seeing different manifestations of the same thing. Does that have a name? And have you run into that perspective before?
Yes, it does have a name. It's actually referred to as, religious pluralism. It's a kind of a topic within the study of religion that does try to negotiate all the various different voices surrounding, questions for convenience sake we'll dub an ultimate concern. And it has been managed in many different ways. So you'll have examples of individuals who will say, yes, we recognize all of the internal contradictions going on with respect to the religious traditions in question. But what's really required in that context is to appreciate, say, a universal view of life's final aim, as it were, and then see religions as all involved in kind of gesturing toward such an ultimate aim, but none of them have the ability to speak on behalf of it definitively, right? So what they try to do is, well, at least in the 1980s and 1990s, there was this preoccupation to manage the exclusivisms of religion in a way that transcends an inclusivist orientation, which says, my tradition could honor, your tradition, but ours is, of course, more insightful, and that's why we subscribe to its teachings. And then you'll have a pluralistic viewpoint, like the one I just mentioned, that has a general theoretical understanding, which is supposed to help us negotiate all of the differences. But in our context, that has become a very problematic point of view. That is because what it does in many respects is it recognizes the differences between religious traditions, but tries to eliminate those differences by an extrinsic theory that can help us, recognize the value of all the traditions without, respecting, as it were, an insider's perspective of their tradition. So in our current day, in our so-called postmodern day, there's this appreciation or valuing of difference without eliminating those differences. So it's just a general recognition that, yes, this tradition will obviously say that, God has appeared to it in this form, in its ultimate form, and, predecessors don't have the ultimate vision of the divine. But it's that kind of unique identity cannot be eliminated by this kind of extrinsic universal theory that kind of mutes the uniqueness of the identity in question. And so, yes, that's a very difficult question that's also managed in terms of contemporary understandings of secularism and how we can make room for difference while honoring the differences and rather than eliminating the differences.
So what are some perspectives that you've seen over the years that you thought were, I don't know, super insightful, even if you don't ascribe to them, but you're like, oh, wow, very, very interesting. Any perspectives you run into?
Yeah, well, in my perspective, as somebody who is seeking a broader understanding of religion, a kind of intellectually respectable view of religion, I've always been interested in questions of theory and method and how it frames our understanding. And so I have been very much interested in contemporary, more or less materialistic, reductionistic, scientific views of religion, which served as the general background against which religion for for well over a century, at least since the modern scientific revolution, has always had to work against or defend itself in the face of. So for me, that clearing that I was talking about is really important so that we can negotiate religion in a fair way, so that no longer can we assume the mechanistic worldview of science, which was the going orthodoxy for a long time. And so it raises interesting questions in our contemporary context, like what is the nature of consciousness? Is consciousness the result of brain functioning? Or is consciousness non-local? And what this does for me is it provides contemporary languages, contemporary ways of meaning that revitalize ancient questions, ways in which people of faith can somehow mediate intellectually responsibly their own understandings, their ancient understandings, and possibly revise them or enhance them in the context with which intellectuals in the Western world have been dealing with since time immemorial. Yeah, I know. I guess this sounds rather abstract, but in my context, how it's generally understood that the ivory tower of academia or the university is kind of cut off from the real world, and so the only usefulness of such an enterprise is if it can make connections with the so-called real world outside of its gates. And although on the one hand, I recognize the importance of that, and for sure I do, I also recognize, as somebody who is, a card-carrying academic, that there is a real world as well in the ivory tower, where people are constantly negotiating these questions of meaning, but are somehow seen as valuable only with respect to how it can be mediated out there in the real world. And all the while, the ones inhabiting what for me is also that real world are rather estranged from mediating and raising the questions that are supplied, for example, by their own fields of interest and have had a deeply personal impact on them, even if their primary task is to kind of, in the name of objectivity, leave out their subjectivity from such questioning. And I'm glad you pointed out the issues in biology today and how diverse and complicated it has become, so that it kind of raises interesting questions for you as an individual who I imagine was, brought up with some sort of exposure to the Abrahamic traditions. Is my assumption wrong? I don't know.
I was raised, supposed to be Jewish, but my parents didn't do too much I was a bad Jew. I didn't learn very much. So I have to learn it now.
That's okay. I was a bad Christian too. But the idea is that those worlds that we were born into and that we've inherited, a general understanding about the world that we may, for example, have left behind because we've been tutored in more advanced ways of understanding the world, in more scientific ways and more intellectual ways. This clearing that I've been talking about from within the ivory tower has kind of allowed for the emergence of a reappreciation of traditions and what they signify and how they can be mediated responsibly in light of our current interests and our current ways of looking at the world. So that, biology has become very complex, and it is allowed now for the emergence of new ways of relating, say, religious metaphysical belief systems with regard to what we can know in biology. And the same with psychology, and the same with sociology. All these fields are changing, but what is not being broached so much, and I'll say this in the context of religious studies, is how individuals in university have their own perspective on life and can negotiate it themselves without having to feel timid about the prospect because it kind of betrays a subjectivism. So I'm really interested in helping those individuals, myself included, mediate an appreciation of what some would characterize as religious or spiritual in the context of academia. And then, of course, part of the art of doing that move that I spoke about earlier in terms of moving into the real world is communicating that in such a way that's effective for people who aren't specializing in some, area of interest, which is, of course, a daunting task. People like John Lennox, for example, has probably achieved that with regard to the, individuals who, say, entertain a notion of God like he does. So it helps individuals. He communicates it in a very efficient way, so that individuals are able to appreciate his form of apologetics, and also his kind of debates with new materialists or new atheists and so on. And I think that's valuable work. I'm just very aware of its species nature, that it's just one aspect, a subspecies of philosophy of religion in the contemporary world. And so there's some positive, but also some, this kind of need to I guess you would say, just be responsible about how that kind of knowledge is mediated, so that we're very sensitive to how this may impact individuals who may not have the same sensibility or who may not entertain the same framework of philosophizing about the world. And so it becomes a complex thing, but I think an awareness of it is a virtue, and something that requires a magnanimous kind of spirit to do justice to a wide variety of approaches, and to do so responsibly.
What books, how would you recommend people that are interested in both the history and philosophy of religion get started? They're not going to be necessarily academics like you, but is there any book or books or initial starting materials that people would find accessible and helpful?
Yeah, for sure. I use a really, really helpful book, an introductory book that I use in a very large class that I teach at my own university, entitled Introduction to the Study of Religions. And what is really unique about this book, it was published in 2009 by Hilary Rodriguez and Sam Harding. What's really good about this book is it takes students through a kind of chronological outline of the way in which the religious phenomenon has been studied throughout history. And you can see all the wide variety of approaches which sensitize students to the very complex nature of identifying religion, and being able to understand the theorists who have kind of classified religion in a certain way that has become an important part of the Western tradition of analysis. And of course, this is being expanded on by individuals who are interested in religion in a wide variety of different parts of the world. But nonetheless, this is a good primer for introducing people to both the nature of the phenomenon in question, namely religion, and how it has been managed throughout the history of its analysis or study. And I think that has become a bedrock, really, of studying religion in our day and age in a responsible fashion that recognizes the differences of the religious traditions, and also the individual approaches to the study of religion, which give us specific type knowledge, which then we have to mediate in our own context with our own questions and come to some sort of conclusion. That's one particular book. I'm currently publishing a book on what I've basically just in a roundabout way have been speaking to you about in terms of what I call philosophy of religious studies, which is more to kind of sensitize academics to all of the sensitive issues at play when dealing with religion, and a kind of intellectually responsible way of doing it in our age, in our postmodern age, where the varieties and differences of approaches and understandings of religion have been heightened to a degree which is kind of mind-boggling. But it is a way of just saying, look, here are so many different ways of approaching religions, and there is still work to be done from a personal, subjective point of view. My volume is entitled Personalizing Philosophy of Religion. personalizing philosophy of religion, which means to underline the importance of our agency in the study of religion. Hopefully that'll be released in the coming year by the State University of New York Press.
Well, very good, Jim. What's the best way for people to find out more about your work? Where can they go?
They, of course, can do a search on Google, of course, and they'll find my volumes there. But if they want to get something less abstract in terms of, my knee-jerk reactions on a day-to-day basis, a place to turn is basically Twitter, at Jim Kanaris. I also have a blog on wordpress.com, Jim Kanaris at wordpress.com, or jimkanaris.wordpress.com, where I kind of try to translate all of the heady stuff that I tend to introduce my students to in university in more personable terms, although I'm not always terribly successful at it.
No problem. Well, Jim, thank you for coming on the podcast, and I appreciate it.
I really appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.